I'm posting this here because it feels safer than saying it out loud, and because strangers on the internet don't look at you the way people who know your face do. I'm not proud of what I did. I'm also not pretending I didn't choose it. At the time, I worked for a debt collection outfit. Not the cartoonish kind with baseball bats. Mostly phone calls, spreadsheets, addresses highlighted in red. Still, you spend long enough telling people they owe money they don't have, and something inside you starts to thin out. I was good at it. Too good. I knew how to sound calm while ruining someone's afternoon, how to apply pressure without raising my voice. After a while, the job stopped feeling like work and started feeling like erosion. The crime I'm talking about didn't start as a crime in my head. That's important. It started as solving a problem. I was behind on my own bills, ironically enough, and my boss had made it clear that empathy didn't count as productivity. There was this one account, someone who owed a lot, someone who kept dodging calls. I had their address, their routine, little fragments of their life laid out in a file. And somewhere between the fluorescent lights of the office and the hum of my car engine, I convinced myself that stepping outside the rules was just another way of doing my job. I wasn't desperate in the cinematic sense. No eviction notice taped to my door, no dramatic countdown. Just tired, numb, and quietly angry. That's the most dangerous combination I've learned. You don't feel like a villain. You feel like a guy correcting an imbalance. And once you frame it that way, it's disturbingly easy to take the next step. That's where this story begins. Once the idea took root, it didn't feel dramatic. It felt administrative. That's what scares me looking back, the way I treated it like a checklist instead of a moral line. I told myself I wasn't planning a crime, I was just verifying information. I reread the account file more times than I want to admit. Name, address, notes from previous collectors, vague comments like uncooperative and claims hardship. I memorized the details the way you memorize directions before a long drive. Not because you're excited, because you don't want surprises. Most of the preparation happened in my head. That's where I rehearsed conversations, imagined resistance, practiced sounding reasonable. I thought about timing, about when people are most tired and least alert. I paid attention to my own habits too, what I wore, how I spoke, how I carried myself when I wanted to look official without being questioned. It's unsettling how much of that skill came directly from the job. I didn't tell anyone. Not friends, not coworkers. I justified that as professionalism. Loose lips, I told myself. Really, I just didn't want to hear my own plan spoken back to me in someone else's voice. Silence has a way of making bad ideas feel cleaner. The night before, I barely slept. Not because I was panicking, but because my brain wouldn't stop running scenarios. If this happens, I'll say that. If that goes wrong, I'll walk away. I gave myself exits on paper and in my mind, which made it feel controlled. Safe. Like I was being responsible about something irresponsible. By morning, the plan felt solid, not flawless, but inevitable. I remember standing in front of the mirror, straightening my jacket, thinking how ordinary I looked. No mask. No weapon. Just another guy heading out to handle a problem. That normality was the final lie I told myself before everything crossed from thought into action. I drove out there in the late afternoon, when the day starts to sag under its own weight. Rush hour energy without the urgency. People are tired then. They make mistakes. I parked a block away, not because I was being clever, but because I didn't want my car remembered if things went sideways. The building was one of those places that tries to look neutral, like it doesn't want to admit anyone actually lives there. Beige walls, identical doors, a faint smell of old carpet, and something fried. I sat in the car longer than I needed to, hands on the steering wheel, telling myself this was still optional. That I could leave. That I was choosing to stay. When I finally walked up, my heart wasn't racing the way movies tell you it should. It was steady. Focused. That almost bothered me more. I checked the door number twice, not out of fear, but habit. Accuracy mattered. I knocked in a way I'd learned at work, firm, confident, not aggressive. The knock of someone who expects to be answered. While I waited, I adjusted my posture, softened my face. I'd practiced that part. Looking like a guy doing a job, not a guy looking for trouble. I could hear movement inside, shuffling, a cough, the muted sound of a TV. Real-life noises. The kind that remind you there's a person on the other side of the door, not just a line in a database. When the door opened, I felt the moment stretch. Recognition flickered across their face, not of me specifically, but of what I represented. Authority adjacent. Problems incarnate. I introduced myself using the version of the truth I'd settled on, enough honesty to sound credible, enough omission to stay in control. Standing there, threshold between public and private, I remember thinking, this is it. Not the crime itself, but the point of no return. Once you step inside someone else's space under false pretenses, you don't get to pretend you're still just thinking things through. You're already doing it. They hesitated, just a second too long, and I used that pause the way I'd been trained to, filled it with calm words, a measured explanation, the promise that this would be quick. I stepped inside before the hesitation could harden into refusal. That was the moment. The literal crossing. Once the door closed behind me, the air felt different, heavier, like I'd walked into a place where my excuses didn't echo back the same way. The apartment was small and cluttered in a lived-in way. Not messy, just tired. Stacks of unopened mail, a couch that had clearly doubled as a bed, dishes soaking in the sink like they'd been forgotten mid-thought. All the visual evidence of someone barely keeping pace with their own life. I clocked these details automatically, the way a predator notices exits without meaning to. We stood awkwardly near the door at first. I didn't sit. Sitting implies staying. Staying invites conversation. I needed control, not comfort. I explained why I was there in that practiced voice, neutral, professional, almost sympathetic. I watched their shoulders slump as the words landed. I'd seen that posture 100 times, usually through a phone line. Seeing it in person felt sharper. They started explaining. Everyone does. A job that fell through. Medical bills. A chain of bad luck that sounded rehearsed but still sincere. I nodded at the right moments, gave small acknowledgments. Inside, I was monitoring the situation like a chessboard. How far could I push? How much resistance was there really? When I finally mentioned the alternative, the unofficial way of handling things, the room went quiet. Not angry quiet. Confused quiet. The kind where someone is trying to figure out if they misheard you or if the world just tilted slightly off its axis. I could feel my pulse in my throat then, a reminder that this wasn't a call I could hang up on. That was when I realized something important. I wasn't just taking advantage of their debt. I was exploiting their exhaustion. And the worst part? I knew exactly how to do it because I'd been trained to recognize it. I didn't frame it as a threat. That's the thing people always get wrong when they imagine this kind of moment. I framed it as a favor. A workaround. A way to make the problem smaller instead of bigger. I lowered my voice, leaned in just enough to seem like I was letting them in on a secret instead of cornering them. I told them paperwork could disappear. That payment plans could be adjusted. I said words like temporary and off the record. I avoided saying what I wanted outright at first, letting the implication do the heavy lifting. Silence can be persuasive if you give it room to work. They filled it with nervous questions, half-finished sentences, apologies that weren't really directed at me. When I finally said it plainly, what I needed, what would make this all go away, their face changed. Not outrage. Not fear. Just a kind of dull disbelief, like they were watching themselves from a distance. I could almost hear the gears turning. Is this real? Is this happening? Do I have a choice? They asked me if I was serious. I said yes, calmly, like I was confirming office hours. That was the moment my stomach tightened. Not because I was unsure, but because I knew I'd just crossed another line, one that didn't come with training manuals or scripts. This was me now. Not the job. Me. They paced. I stayed still. That imbalance mattered. They kept glancing at the door, at the window, at me. I kept my hands visible, my posture relaxed. I wanted them to feel like resistance would be exhausting, not dangerous. That agreeing would be easier than fighting, easier than making noise, easier than escalating. Inside, something split. One part of me was counting seconds, tracking outcomes. The other part was screaming quietly, asking how I'd gotten here and why I wasn't stopping. I told myself I could still walk away. That I would, if they said no clearly enough. But I also knew I'd designed this situation so no would feel heavier than yes. When they finally spoke, their voice was barely above a whisper. And the answer they gave set everything else in motion. They didn't hand anything over right away. Instead, they sat down hard on the edge of the couch like their legs had finally given up on them. I stayed standing. I remember noticing how loud the refrigerator was, how every mechanical click felt like it was underlining the silence between us. They asked how they could be sure I'd keep my word. That question hit me harder than I expected. Not because I didn't have an answer. I did, but because it forced me to hear myself justify the unjustifiable. I told them this wasn't my first time helping someone out. I said my reputation mattered. I even smiled, like that made the idea of trust less absurd. They went to a drawer and pulled out an envelope. Not thick. Not dramatic. Just worn, like it had been opened and resealed too many times. I could see their hands shaking as they counted. That's the detail that stuck with me later, not the money itself, but the care they took with it, as if each bill had already been promised to something else. When they held it out, there was a pause. A long one. I could have stopped it there. I could have said this wasn't right, that I was leaving, that they should report me. All the exits I'd imagined were still technically available. Instead, I reached out and took the envelope. The moment our fingers brushed, something jolted through me. Not excitement. Not fear. Awareness. This was real now in a way planning never is. There was no version of this where I was still just a guy doing his job. I thanked them. Actually thanked them. The words slipped out automatically, like muscle memory. I told them what would happen next, how I'd mark the account, what kind of silence they could expect. I gave specifics because specifics sound trustworthy. They nodded, not really listening anymore. Their eyes were unfocused, like they were already replaying the moment in their head, trying to figure out how they'd explain it to themselves later. As I turned to leave, they asked one more question. A simple one. Do you do this a lot? I didn't answer right away. And that hesitation, that tiny, human delay, ended up costing me more than I understood at the time. I gave them a half answer, something vague about case by case, and left before the silence could demand more honesty than I had left. The hallway felt narrower on the way out. Or maybe that was just my shoulders pulling inward, trying to make myself smaller now that the envelope was in my jacket. I didn't open it in the car. That felt like bad luck, like counting money at a crime scene. I drove a few blocks first, mind buzzing, replaying everything I'd said, everything I hadn't. That last question stuck with me. Not because it threatened me, but because it reframed me. I wasn't a one-time anomaly in their story anymore. I was a pattern. A type of person. That's when I noticed the car behind me. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. Same turns happen sometimes. Same red lights. But after the third mirror check, my chest tightened. The car wasn't tailing me aggressively. No high beams, no close following. Just there. Patient. Observant. I started narrating my own behavior in my head the way I would have if this were someone else's account. You're overreacting. You just did something stressful. Adrenaline does this. But I also changed lanes. Slowed down. Sped up. The car adjusted with me. By the time I pulled into a grocery store parking lot, my mouth was dry. I sat there, engine running, watching reflections ripple across the windshield. The other car rolled in and parked 2 rows away. Not close enough to confront me. Not far enough to ignore. I didn't get out. Neither did they. That was the first moment I felt real fear, not the abstract kind you anticipate, but the kind that settles in your gut and refuses to be reasoned with. I thought about the envelope. About fingerprints. About how easily confidence collapses into evidence once someone else starts paying attention. After a few minutes that felt like an hour, the car left. I sat there long after, hands still on the wheel, realizing something I hadn't planned for at all. Even if no one reported me, even if everything went smoothly, I'd just introduced unpredictability into my life. And unpredictability doesn't care how careful you think you are. I didn't go home right away. I drove aimlessly, letting the city blur into a series of turns I wouldn't remember later. When I finally did pull over, it was at a gas station I'd never used before. I went inside, bought a coffee I didn't want, and stood there staring at the rack of snacks like they held answers. In the bathroom, I locked myself into a stall and finally opened the envelope. The amount wasn't huge. That surprised me. I'd built it up in my head as something that would at least justify the risk, like numbers could retroactively make it make sense. Instead, it looked pathetic. Rent and groceries money. The kind of cash that disappears into life without leaving a mark. I felt stupid for a second, stupid for risking everything for something so small. Then came the rationalizations, right on schedule. They would have paid more eventually anyway. I didn't hurt them physically. The system already hurts them worse. Each thought lined up neatly, like coworkers agreeing in a meeting no one wants to be in. But underneath that was a quieter realization: I couldn't undo this. Even if nothing else ever came of it, I'd already changed my internal math. I'd proven to myself that I could do it, that with the right tone and timing, I could take something that wasn't offered. I flushed the coffee down the sink without drinking it and stared at my reflection. I looked exactly the same. No villain glow-up. No visible cracks. Just a guy with slightly bloodshot eyes and a secret that suddenly felt very loud. When I got back in the car, my phone buzzed. A work email. Routine. Mundane. It reminded me that tomorrow I'd be back at my desk, calling other people, pretending the rules still meant something to me. And that's when it hit me: the hardest part wasn't fear of getting caught. It was knowing I'd have to act normal now that normal didn't mean the same thing anymore. The next few days were a masterclass in self-deception. I woke up expecting sirens, emails marked urgent, a knock that meant consequences. None came. The world stayed boringly intact, which made it dangerously easy to start rewriting the story in my head. I told myself I'd help them. That's the word I used, helped. I imagined their relief, the way the pressure must have eased once I walked out with that envelope. I focused on the idea that the system would have crushed them anyway, that I'd just taken a shortcut through the same outcome. If anything, I was efficient. Humane, even. That's how warped my thinking got. At work, I leaned into routine like it was a life raft. Same scripts, same keyboard shortcuts, same hollow sympathy. But every time someone on the other end of the line hesitated, every time I heard that familiar exhaustion, I felt a flicker of something ugly. Not temptation exactly. Recognition. I knew how close the edge was now, how thin the line between policy and predation could feel if you stopped respecting it. I watched myself more closely than I ever had before. My tone. My phrasing. The way I lingered on certain details in an account file. I told myself this was vigilance, that I was making sure I didn't cross the line again. But the truth is, I was cataloging possibilities. Not acting on them, just noticing them. And noticing was enough to make me uneasy. At night, the scene replayed differently each time. Sometimes they were angrier. Sometimes I was colder. Sometimes I walked away before taking the envelope, and I'd wake up with a split second of relief before reality corrected me. Guilt doesn't always show up as shame. Sometimes it shows up as edits, as your brain trying to workshop a better ending. By the end of the week, I realized something else had changed. I'd stopped asking whether what I did was wrong and started asking whether it was worth it. That shift scared me more than the envelope ever did. About 2 weeks later, the account popped back up on my screen. Not flagged. Not escalated. Just active again, like nothing I'd promised had actually stuck. My chest tightened in a way I hadn't felt since the parking lot. I clicked through the notes, scanning for my own digital fingerprints. There was a comment I didn't remember typing, neutral, vague, the kind of thing anyone on the floor could have written. It protected me, technically. It also meant the problem wasn't gone. I stared at the name longer than I should have. The system doesn't care about context. Dead ages. Interest accrues. Files resurface. All my careful language, all that talk about things going away, had only delayed the inevitable. I realized then that I hadn't solved anything. I'd just bought myself time, and not even much of it. A day later, I got a call transferred to me. Their voice. I knew it instantly. They didn't accuse me outright. They danced around it, asking why the calls had started again, asking if there'd been a mistake. I kept my tone professional, detached, the way you do when you're trying not to sound like yourself. But my pulse was loud in my ears. Every word felt like it could tip something over. They said they'd done what I asked? They said it quietly, like a reminder, not a threat. That was worse. It meant they expected consistency. Integrity. From me. I told them I'd look into it, bought myself another lie, and ended the call as cleanly as I could. Afterward, I sat there, hands hovering over the keyboard, realizing I'd created a relationship I couldn't manage. Not a transaction. A dependency? They had leverage now too, memory, expectation, the knowledge that I wasn't who I claimed to be. I thought the danger was getting caught by the system. I hadn't considered what it meant to be known by the person I wronged. That's when it really hit me. Crimes don't end when you walk away. They echo. And once they do, you don't get to choose what comes back. I tried to fix it quietly. That was my first mistake after the original one, believing there was still quiet option. I moved notes around, nudged dates, did the kind of internal housekeeping that usually goes unnoticed. Each keystroke felt louder than the last, like I was tapping on glass. It worked for about a week. Then a supervisor pinged me. Casual message. Hey, can you walk me through your handling of this account? No accusation. No urgency. Just curiosity wrapped in corporate politeness. My stomach dropped anyway. Curiosity is how audits start. Curiosity is how patterns get noticed. I rehearsed my explanation the same way I'd rehearsed everything else, calm, reasonable, boring. I emphasized policy. I leaned on ambiguity. I answered questions without volunteering anything extra. The meeting ended without fireworks, but I walked out knowing something had shifted. Attention had found me. That afternoon, I got another call from them. This time they sounded different. Tighter. They said someone else had contacted them. They asked if I was still their guy. That phrase, their guy, made my skin crawl. I realized then how thoroughly I'd misjudged the situation. I thought I was exploiting exhaustion. I hadn't accounted for desperation turning into expectation, and expectation hardening into entitlement. They didn't threaten me. They didn't need to. They just asked what they were supposed to do now. I gave them an answer that split the difference between truth and self-preservation. I told them I couldn't help anymore. That it was out of my hands. I tried to sound final without sounding afraid. There was a long pause on the line. Then they said something that still rings in my ears. So that was just once then. When the call ended, I sat there staring at my screen, realizing the worst part wasn't the risk to my job. It was the fact that I'd taught someone a cruel lesson, that mercy could be conditional, and that people like me disappear the moment accountability shows up. That night, for the first time since it happened, I didn't try to justify anything. I just felt tired. Heavy. Like I was carrying a version of myself I couldn't set down anymore. A few days after that call, compliance sent out a blanket notice about process irregularities. No names. No accusations. Just a reminder that logs were being reviewed and deviations would be addressed. It read like boilerplate, but I felt like it was written directly to me. I started sleeping with my phone on the nightstand, volume all the way up. Every notification jolted me awake. I'd scroll through emails at 3 a.m., convinced I'd missed something, a calendar invite, a subject line that meant this is it. Nothing ever did. The absence became its own kind of torment. At work, I caught myself flinching when people walked past my desk. I avoided eye contact with supervisors, which only made me more noticeable in my own head. I stopped joking with coworkers. I stopped volunteering for anything. My world narrowed to the bare minimum required to not stand out. Then came the audit meeting. Not mine specifically. A team-wide review. Conference room, bad coffee, PowerPoint slides about best practices. I sat there nodding along, hands folded, heart hammering like I was hiding something under the table. At one point, a slide went up showing a redacted example of inappropriate account handling. The details were vague, but close enough to mine that my throat went dry. No one looked at me. No finger pointed. The meeting ended with action items and reminders and everyone filing out, already forgetting most of what was said. I stayed seated for a moment after the room emptied, letting the adrenaline drain out of me in shaky waves. That was when I understood how thin the margin had been. How easily a different question, a slightly deeper look, could have collapsed everything. I hadn't gotten away with it because I was smart. I'd gotten away with it because systems are imperfect and attention is finite. Walking back to my desk, I didn't feel relief. I felt exposed. Like I'd brushed up against the edge of a life I didn't want and realized there was nothing mystical keeping me from falling into it, just luck, and other people being busy. The money didn't last. That's the part that feels almost insulting in hindsight. It went to exactly what I told myself it would: utilities, a late fee, groceries. No trophy. No transformation. Just a slightly quieter week. What lingered was everything else. I started noticing how often I scanned rooms for exits. How my jaw stayed clenched even when nothing was happening. Conversations felt like performances I could forget a line in. I'd be halfway through a sentence and suddenly wonder if I sounded like someone hiding something. Guilt does that. It turns you into your own surveillance system. The worst moments came when I imagined them on the other end of things. Not the day it happened, but the days after. The waiting. The hope that maybe this awful compromise had actually fixed something. I'd taken more than money. I'd taken certainty. And certainty, I learned, is a kind of shelter. I considered quitting. Fantasized about it, really. Walking out, leaving the job and the version of myself it had coaxed into existence. But quitting felt like an admission I wasn't ready to make. Staying felt like penance. I chose the coward's middle path: endure. Some nights I'd draft messages I never sent, confessions to friends, to anonymous inboxes, to no one. I'd delete them all. I told myself I was protecting people. The truth was simpler. I didn't want to hear my actions reflected back to me in someone else's words. By then, the thrill was long gone. So was the fear. What remained was a dull, grinding awareness that I'd paid a price I couldn't itemize. I'd become less patient. Less generous in my assumptions. I'd learned how easily I could rationalize harm if it wore the right uniform. And once you learn that about yourself, you don't get to unlearn it. Nothing dramatic ever happened. No knock. No summons. No moment where the universe lined everything up and demanded payment in a single, cinematic blow. The resolution came quietly, the way most real consequences do, through subtraction. I didn't get fired. I wasn't promoted either. I became invisible. Trusted enough to keep, unremarkable enough to overlook. At first, that felt like mercy. Later, I realized it was a ceiling. I'd capped myself with my own behavior, limited what I could safely be given access to. Whether anyone consciously knew or not, the system adjusted around me. I eventually transferred departments. Different role, fewer accounts, less direct pressure. I told people it was about work-life balance. That wasn't a lie exactly. It was about not hearing that tone of voice anymore, the one that reminded me how easily authority can be bent if you stop respecting the person on the other end. As for them, we never spoke again. The account moved on, handled by people who didn't know the backstory and didn't need to. Sometimes I'd search the name out of habit, then stop myself. Curiosity felt too much like intrusion. Letting go was the only decent thing I had left to offer. The real resolution wasn't external. It was internal and uncomfortable, accepting that I could do something wrong, get away with it, and still not be okay. Accepting that, not being caught, and being innocent, are entirely different states of being. I'd crossed a line and walked back over it, but the line was still there in my head, bright and unmistakable. I didn't become a better person overnight. I just became a more honest one, about my limits, my rationalizations, and the kind of situations I should never put myself in again. That's not redemption. It's maintenance. And for now, it's enough to keep me from repeating the worst version of myself. I don't tell this story to shock anyone. There are bigger crimes, uglier ones, stories with clearer villains. Mine is small enough to hide in plain sight, and that's exactly why it matters to me. It taught me how ordinary harm can be when it's wrapped in procedure and delivered by someone who sounds reasonable. What I learned is this: the most dangerous lies are the ones that make you feel practical, necessary, efficient. If you ever catch yourself thinking, "I'm not hurting anyone that badly," stop right there. That's the thought that opens doors you won't notice closing behind you. If you're in a job, or a situation, that slowly teaches you to see people as obstacles, numbers, or leverage, pay attention to how you talk about it when you're alone. That's where the real damage shows up first. Long before anyone else notices. Long before there are consequences you can name. My advice, for whatever it's worth, don't confuse access with entitlement. Don't confuse silence with consent. And don't assume that getting away with something means you escaped it. Some things follow you without making a sound. I'm still working. Still paying bills. Still trying to be decent in small, unremarkable ways. This story isn't a confession because I expect forgiveness. It's a reminder, to myself as much as anyone, that losing yourself doesn't happen all at once. It happens quietly, one reasonable decision at a time.